Okay. For obvious reasons, I decided to speak in English. You heard my Spanish. What I'm going to be talking about today is the role of feeds in hatchery biosecurity. Over the last 10 years, world production of shrimp has declined. The rate of growth of the industry has declined quite a bit. After a period of rapid growth from 2000 up to 2008, we began a period of very slow growth. And the reason for the slow growth of the industry has really boiled down to disease problems. We've had a lot of problems with emerging diseases of AHP&D. Of course, there's always been white spot. We have EHP in Asia, and we've also been dealing with covert mortality syndrome in Asia. The biggest impacts have been in Asia, where AHP&D first appeared in China in 2009. It spread to Vietnam in 2012, or 2011, and then from there it spread to Malaysia and India. It's been everywhere it spread to. In Thailand, we've seen big drops in production. Production dropped about 40,000 metric tons per year after it was introduced in 2012. So the impact of disease has been pretty great. We've seen similar impacts, especially due to AHP&D when it arrived in Mexico. In Mexico in 2012, AHP&D was imported with animals that came from Asia, and in 1 year, production fell by nearly half. So there's been a slow recovery in Mexico, but the disease has spread south to Honduras, where production has fallen and has been more or less level ever since 2013 or 14. Nicaragua has seen declines in production, Panama and Guatemala as well. So these impacts are largely due to problems in biosecurity. Biosecurity has been defined by the FAO OIE as measures that implementation of measures that reduce the risk of introduction of disease agents and pathogens. And it requires that people adopt a set of attitudes and behaviors that will reduce the risk of introduction of diseases into captive stocks of animals. The hatchery industry has really been one of the culprits in the biosecurity problems that the industry has faced. A lot of this has to do with the use of live feeds and fresh feeds in the industry. Maturation diets are typically consist of polychaetes, squid, marine bivalves such as mussels and oysters, clams, Artemia biomass, and krill. In larval rearing, we're also dependent upon live feeds, microalgae such as Cattosaurus and Thalassiocyra, Tetraselmis, and Artemia nauplii. Many of these fresh feeds and natural feeds that we're using in the hatcheries have been identified as possible vectors for the introduction of a number of the diseases that have had the biggest impacts on the industry. Polychaetes, for example, have been shown to be carriers of white spot, AHP&D, EMS, Other Vibrios as well, Vibrio harveyi, and also EHP, the microsporidium that causes slow growth syndromes. Marine bivalves also have been implicated of introducing all of these same diseases, as have Artemia biomass. With Artemia biomass, it really depends on the source. The Artemia biomass that comes from China in particular has been a source of introduction of certain diseases, including EHP and AHPND. Squid isn't exempt either. Squid has been a source of introduction of white spot, AHPND, Vibrios. When we're talking about squid, we're talking about local squid, locally produced squid that are caught from areas where we have shrimp culture going on. So if you were to buy squid from California, at least in the past, that's been a fairly safe source. I'm not sure how that's going to continue in the future with AHPND problems perhaps moving north out of Mexico. Artemia nauplii in the hatcheries are also a major source of introduction of disease, especially Vibrios. There's good evidence that these fresh feeds have been a major source of introduction of AHPND into the laboratories. And the evidence for that really is that they've looked at, taken PCR tests, they've looked at the broodstock in hatcheries that frequently test positive for AHPND. However, if you test the source of the broodstock, the SPF animals that are being purchased by the hatcheries, these almost, well, exclusively, they are negative for AHPND. But once they get brought into the hatchery, a little while later you can test them and they are positive. Water treatment systems are very effective at removing pathogens, so that really leaves the feed as being the major source, a potential source of AHPND into the hatcheries. Tim Flegel in Thailand, his laboratory did a lot of testing of different feeds, maturation feeds, and also of broodstock and nauplii. And this is in hatcheries in Thailand, and they found a very high percentage of the broodstock or the feces of broodstock were infected by AHPND. The nauplii that were coming out of those broodstock also, many of them were infected. And then they tested the food. Polychaetes, 71% of the polychaetes that they tested from 3 different areas of the country tested positive for AHPND. Squid also tested positive, Artemia biomass, and bivalves as well. So there's pretty clear evidence that the feed is a major source of introduction of these Vibrios into the hatchery. So how can we reduce the risk of associated with the use of these fresh feeds? Well, one of the obvious things that we can do is we can eliminate the use of live feeds, especially live polychaetes. That's not really too much of an issue here in Latin America. Most hatcheries are using frozen polychaetes. But in Asia, that's not the case. In Asia, fresh polychaetes, live polychaetes are very popular, are used by most of the hatcheries in Vietnam and China. I would say that they have kind of an addiction to the live polychaetes. Live polychaetes support really high levels of production. You can typically get about 15% of the females will spawn per night. Typical size of the spawns is close to 300,000 nauplii per spawn, which is really double what we are accustomed to getting when we use frozen polychaetes. So that really high productivity is very difficult for them to give up. And unfortunately, the cost of that productivity in the hatchery is billions of dollars in economic losses on the farms. And mussels and squid are not exempt from this as well. If you use fresh mussels and squid and from the local area from where the farms are located, that's also very risky behavior and will lead to many of those feeds will be associated with Vibrio and AHPND. So what are the different steps? So one of the steps we can use is eliminate the use of fresh or live feeds, that is, feeds that have never been frozen. So is freezing a good strategy? I think there's good evidence that freezing can dramatically reduce the numbers of pathogenic bacteria in your feeds. This figure here is the results of a study where they took oysters and they put them through a blast freezer. They measured the bacteria levels after putting through the blast freezer. Interestingly, the blast freezing process doesn't have much effect at all on the bacterial content. Counts are just about as high as they were before freezing them. But then they put the oysters in freezers and held them for a period of up to 6 months. And every month they measured the bacterial levels. And they did this at 3 different temperatures. They did it at minus 30 degrees C, at minus 20 degrees C, and at minus 10 degrees C. And it might surprise you to find out that the lowest bacteria levels were associated with the oysters that were stored at minus 10 degrees instead of the colder temperatures. Well, why is this? This is actually a phenomenon that's fairly well known in the frozen seafood industry. When you freeze seafood at very, very cold temperatures, the ice crystals that form in the cells are very small, and they're not really big enough to rupture all of the bacteria. Whereas if you freeze them at minus 10 degrees, the ice crystals that form are larger, and you get more effective reduction of the bacteria loads. In fact, you can reduce the bacteria loads. This is a logarithmic scale. You can reduce the bacteria loads by perhaps 4 log units with freezing. So that's very good. However, notice, even after 6 months, the bacteria levels have not dropped to 0. There's still viable bacteria in this frozen oysters. Another factor that can affect the effectiveness of the freezing process is the initial bacterial load. In this study, they looked at 2 different initial levels of bacteria. One was initially the levels were almost 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 6.5 total bacteria load. The other was 10 to the 5th. These top lines here is the total bacterial counts over a 7-week period. This was at minus 18 degrees. And these lower counts are counts of Vibrio parahemolyticus. With the low loading rate, we were able to drop the, I won't say we, this was a study done by Vasudevan in 2002, but they were able to drop the Vibrio parahemolyticus loads to virtually 0. At the higher loads, though, they were not able to eliminate the Vibrio parahemolyticus. So what are the take-home messages here? 1, freezing is a very effective way of reducing the bacterial loads in the frozen in your fresh feeds. 2, minus 10 degrees is more effective than colder temperatures. And 3, do not expect complete elimination of the bacteria through the freezing process. There will be some bacteria that persist, and then when you put that food into warm water, those bacteria will multiply. So there's still potential for infecting of your animals. Another important step in reducing your risk from pathogens is do PCR testing of the animals. If you test them, each lot of fresh feeds when they arrive at the hatchery for the pathogens listed by OIE, white spot, Taura, IHHMV, HPND, etc., and reject any shipment that comes up positive, that's a very important step in improving your biosecurity. But there's more that can be done. And Albert Tacon, who is a very well-respected nutritionist, I think he may have spoken here. I know he was here 2 years ago. But he, in a paper that he published on the role of feeds in hatchery biosecurity, said that in view of the risks of infirmities due to the use of live feeds and fresh feeds and no processed feeds, that it's clear that the shrimp industry is going to have to begin, particularly the shrimp feed industry, is going to have to begin producing a new generation of feeds that is complete feeds and biosecure feeds for every step of the production cycle, beginning with the first feeding of larvae and following all the way through to maturation of the broodstock. So at Ziegler, we've taken this challenge very seriously. We've been working for quite some time on developing replacements for the live feeds in the hatchery, replacements for Artemia. And we have a new product called Ready Mate, which is we developed with the goal of completely replacing the fresh feeds. We didn't quite achieve that. In fact, I don't know of any prepared diet that completely replaces all of the fresh feeds in the maturation diet. But we're getting there. We're getting close. The advantages of using a formulated feed is that it's 100% free of pathogens. Another advantage is that it's formulated to provide 100% of the nutrient requirements for the broodstock, including optimal levels of HUFAs, pigments, cholesterol, all the different nutrients that are essential for the metabolic needs of the animals to produce the sperm and the ovarian maturation and for spawning. And another advantage of using these formulated feeds is they allow you to do something that you can't do with fresh feeds. And that is, it allows you to add to the feed and introduce immune stimulants to improve the health of the animals and to help them to combat or resist the challenge from disease. And you can also add probiotics to these feeds as well. These feeds, these prepared diets are much easier to store. You don't need a freezer. You can store them in air-conditioned rooms or refrigerators, and the shelf life is much longer than for the frozen feeds. Well, the question is then, do they work? How well if you try to replace polychaetes or other components of the fresh components of the diet, are you going to get the same level of production? So we did a trial recently at a hatchery in Panama. We compared production in tanks where we were feeding a typical maturation diet. Consisting of 31%, 31% of the diet was squid, mussels 17%, Artemia biomass 10%, a dry maturation diet 26%, and polychaetes were almost 15%. So what we did was in 3 tanks we ran the control diet, in 3 tanks we ran a diet in which we replaced all of the polychaetes, so 100% of the polychaetes. We also replaced a significant percentage of the Artemia biomass. We replaced 2/3 of the Artemia biomass, about 1/3 of the mussels, and we replaced all of the dry diet with Ready-Mate, our new maturation product. And these are the results that we got. In terms, I keep trying to point with in advance. There we go. Okay. In terms of spawns per night, percentage spawning, we had very little difference. None of these differences, by the way, are significant. But there's a slightly higher percentage of spawnings per night with the control diets compared to the Ready-Mate, less than 1% difference. However, we had almost identical number of eggs per spawn, 240,000 eggs per spawn. The number of nauplii per spawn actually wasn't a really high percentage for either. That was because the oxygen levels in these tanks were kind of low, and I think that affected the fertility rate. But in any case, the fertility rate was very, very similar, slightly higher actually for the tanks fed with Ready-Mate. We also measured the production index. Production index is the number of nauplii per 100 females per night. For this graph, I just divided that by 100. It's a little easier. The numbers are smaller, easier to put on the graph. But once again, the numbers are very, very similar. No significant difference in terms of the production index, the number of nauplii produced per female per night. There was one big difference, though. The survival of the broodstock fed in the Ready-Mate tanks was much higher, 97.5%. compared to only 78% of the broodstock surviving over the 3-month production period in the control tanks. Now, the reasons for this are probably related to A, the impacts of the fresh feeds on water quality, and B, the fact that Ready-Mate contains immune stimulants, has all of the nutritional requirements, vitamins, minerals, and everything like that, so that they were better able to withstand the challenges from the diseases. And as a result of all of these things, the final thing that we looked at was the number of nauplii total produced over the production cycle. And actually, that number was slightly higher for the Ready-Mate tanks. So, we felt very confident that this is a product that satisfactorily replaces polychaetes and other components of the diet in a very large percentage. So if we can replace these things and get the similar number of nauplii, it's also important that the nauplii are of good quality. And in fact, we found that the quality of the nauplii improved with the Ready-Mate diets. The nauplii had greater quantities of yolk, they had better activity, and they also had better phototaxis. I don't have the data on this, but it was also reported to us that we had significantly better survival in the larval tanks with the Ready-Mate produced nauplii compared to the controls. So let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk about larval rearing. For larval rearing, Vibrio is the main problem we have with disease. And control of vibriosis and Vibrios in the larval tanks is just critical for the quality of the larvae that we produced. There are several sources of Vibrio in the larval tanks, one of which is the microalgal cultures. There have been a number of studies showing that microalgae contaminated with Vibrio is a major vector for Vibrio into the tanks. and it's even suspected that contaminated microalgae cultures may be an important contributing factor to Zoea 2 syndrome. Up until now, there really are no diets that can completely replace algae in the larval diet. It's a very complicated issue to replace algae. It does an awful lot of things for you in addition to the nutritional benefits from the microalgae. It serves as a biofilter in your tank. They also have a probiotic effect in the tank. And so I consider that that's probably the biggest challenge we have in replacing live diets would be to completely replace algae diets. But there are things that we can do to reduce the bacteria loads in the microalgae. It's important that if we can periodically replace the cultures with azenic, bacteria-free cultures coming from the laboratories that specialize in production of pure cultures. We can use good sterile technique when we do our transfers in pure culture systems. It's really important to clean our glassware with acid to destroy the biofilms that develop on the culture vessels. And of course, good water filtration is really important as well. There's a strategy that we've been using at our laboratory at ZARC, the Ziegler Aquaculture Research Laboratory in Florida. We've been doing this for about a year. We started adding probiotics to our cultures and to our algae cultures in the carboys, not in the pure culture room, but in the carboys. And with just feeling that that would help us to control any Vibrios that might be in these cultures. Our first concern was that maybe this might have an impact on the growth of the bacteria, but we found, and I think there have been several other studies that have found the same, it really does not affect the algae densities at all. In our laboratory, we routinely get densities of Cattosaurus of 8 to 10 million cells per milliliter, and 1 to 1.5 times 10 to the 6th cells per milliliter of Thalassiocyra. When I was preparing for this talk, I thought I'd look up and see what kind of effects probiotic treatment of algae has on Vibrio levels. I looked for some data in the literature, and surprisingly, I didn't find anything on this. And so we are now carrying out a study at the ZARC lab where we're going to be studying the effect of adding probiotics to our algae cultures and on the Vibrio counts in these cultures. So stay tuned for that. Okay, Artemia. Artemia is really one of the major sources of Vibrio introduction into the larval rearing tanks. What appears to be happening there is that when the Artemia eggs hatch, the glycols are liberated into the water, and these glycols basically turn that hatching tank into a big nutrient broth for growing Vibrio. And the counts can get very, very high indeed. I think you had some good counts on the last talk on the Vibrio levels coming from your Artemia tanks. Now it turns out that you can do some things to help. You can disinfect your cyst. You can decapsulate, and that should help, you'd think. But in fact, studies have shown that it doesn't really have a big impact on the overall bacterial counts of the Artemia. And it turns out that the Artemia cysts themselves aren't really the source of the Vibrio in those hatching tanks. The main source of Vibrio in those hatching tanks is the biofilms that are coming off, that are on those tanks. So maybe acid cleaning your Artemia tanks would be a helpful strategy. But perhaps the best way of dealing with this issue would be to replace the Artemia cultures altogether. So the question is, can you replace Artemia in the larval diet? And Ziegler has been working on this for many years. We have a diet for replacing Artemia called Easy Artemia. And Easy Artemia is designed to replace 100% of the Artemia in the diet. And we formulated Easy Artemia. It doesn't contain any Artemia, by the way, but it has been formulated to match the nutritional profile of enriched Artemia. So it's got the same level of protein, 52%. It actually has slightly higher levels of fatty acids, especially the long-chain fatty acid, the HUFAs. It's about 3 times higher than Artemia. And fibers fairly similar as well. And then another advantage of Easy Artemia is it has been analyzed. We send off every lot of Easy Artemia to laboratory and have it tested for white spot and AHPNS and other listed diseases. So if you replace Artemia with Easy Artemia, there should be a benefit in terms of the bacteria counts in the larval tanks. And these data here are data from a hatchery in Ecuador that had been having some severe problems with Vibrio. And they were having trouble getting any decent survivals at all, the survivals in the 10%, 20% level. So they decided to do a couple things. They did a cleanup, they did a dry out and cleanup, and then they decided to completely replace Artemia with Easy Artemia. So they did that, and survivals went up immediately, and they started getting survivals close to 70% in the larval rearing tanks. And but some of their customers weren't confident that larvae fed with Easy Artemia would be as good a quality as larvae fed with real Artemia. And so they demanded that the hatchery switch the animals over to Artemia in the last few days before they were harvested. So the hatchery did bacteria counts in tanks that had been reared just with Easy Artemia and compared those to tanks that were fed the last 2 days only with Artemia. And what they found was that the total bacteria counts were lower in the Easy Artemia tanks. The total bacteria counts were lower in the larva compared to the tanks fed with Artemia. But there was a huge effect with the Vibrio. Vibrio alginolyticus and the water levels were several times higher than they were for the Easy Artemia. They were more than double the level in the larva as well. And if we look at Vibrio parahemolyticus, the levels were much, much higher in the tanks with, that had been fed for 2 days only with Artemia compared to those tanks that were fed with only Easy Artemia for the whole cycle. And the same was true of the larvae. So I think this is pretty convincing evidence that replacing Artemia with 100% Artemia replacement product has potential benefits in terms of controlling the Vibrio levels in your larval tanks. So the question is, if it helps with the bacteria levels, can you still get the same levels of performance? These are results from 5 different countries that we've been from hatcheries where they've replaced 100% of the Artemia with Easy Artemia. And if we look at all these different measures of performance, the density that this represents a range. These data represent a range of stocking densities from a high of 300 to a low of 85 per liter. There's a range of feeding rates with Easy Artemia ranging from a low of 1.66 per million PLs to a high of 4.5 per million PLs. But if you look at the length of the cycle, normal development, they got the animals developed on time. reaching levels of PL4 in as few as 10 days, range of 10 days to 12 days. And survivals were very good, ranging from the low was 50% to a Z1 to PL8. And the high, and these are averages of not just one tank, but of, in some cases, the averages were for, a whole season's worth of production. In other cases, it just represents just some control tanks, a controlled study. But 85% survival, 92% survival. So clearly, excellent survivals are possible, replacing Artemia. The animals were harvested at a good weight as well. In India, we did what we called an Easy Artemia challenge. A lot of them were reluctant to try it, so we had them start with 50% replacement. And in this study, you can see in every case the production levels were either just about as high or higher with the Easy Artemia compared to the control tanks. So how do the PLs perform when you get them into a pond? There was a study done in which we took, they raised in 2 hatcheries in Ecuador, they produced 6 million PLs. They stocked 3 million of them. 3 million were produced with Easy Artemia, 3 million with the control with the Artemia cyst. All of the PLs were stocked into raceways and fed for 7 to 12 days on a normal diet, no Easy Artemia or Artemia. But then they were stocked in grow-out ponds. And they stocked 6 ponds with each type of PLs. And they looked at the survival results. And these are the results, and it shows you that the survival was higher, as high or higher in all of the tanks fed with Easy Artemia compared to the tanks fed with Artemia. So there's other advantages as well to using formulated diets to replace natural feeds. We can supplement these diets with immune stimulants, with essential oils, with organic acids, probiotics, vitamins, minerals, and prebiotics. And this can have an important impact on the health of the animals as well, as was shown. So in the past, to summarize, in the past we saw that the hatchery productivity was prioritized over biosecurity and sustainability. There was an attachment to the old methods of feeding fresh feeds and natural feeds, and the result was billions of dollars were lost due to disease caused by these types of practices. But I see that there's a future that looks a lot brighter. As the industry matures, it will begin to prioritize biosecurity, and they will begin to adopt new strategies for feeding in the hatcheries based on prepared feeds, prepared biosecure feeds, and this is going to lead to a new era of sustainability and profitability in the industry. Thank you.